Welcome to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. Today we present a Kaiser Report special, Summer Solutions, in which we propose possible solutions to the economic, monetary, and financial crisis that ails us all. Today we're talking to Professor Steve Keen about the banking sector, which ails us so, Minsky moments that trouble us repeatedly, and all that frickin' debt and other stuff. I'm here with Stacey Herbert. And hi. Steve Keen, welcome back.
Thank you.
All right, we're talking solutions. Stacey, how's we getting going on this?
Well, let's talk about the biggest solution on the planet today, and that's been austerity. We had the crisis, the great financial crisis, the GFC of 2007, 2008. The banking systems around the world, but in particular the Anglo-Saxon, Western sort of countries, were on the verge of collapse. We had bank runs at Northern Rock, for example. Lehman Brothers collapsed. All that stuff happened. Everybody at the time agreed that it was the bankers and all their crimes and all their dodgy debt. But since then, everybody seems to agree that it's the ordinary person out there, the worker, the slave wage worker out there, is their fault, and that they need austerity. So how is it that austerity, what is it supposed to solve? What do they think it's solving? And why isn't it solving that?
Okay. It comes down to a naive view of money, which sounds weird, but conventional economic theory, which all these people have swallowed either in first-year courses or they go all the way through their PhD, they've swallowed the idea that money doesn't matter. Might sound ridiculous, but that's what they believe. So they think that money's like a commodity, like gold. They actually think we're still living in a world of gold where you can dig the stuff up. And the idea is that if you dig more of the stuff, you're going to have inflation. If you have less of it, the price system will adjust. So they've got this automatic equilibrium adjusting idea to it. But the real thing with austerity comes from a guy called Robert Barrow. And he wrote what was called the Ricardian approach to budget deficits about 25, 30 years ago. And he made a set of arguments which, when you state them out, you think, what was this guy smoking when he came up with them? But this is the basis. I want to go through them. Yeah. Basic idea is, I said, that if the government runs a deficit today, that must mean in the future a surplus of exactly, when you discount for time, of exactly the same scale. So deficit now means surplus in the future. So if you're going to get extra government spending now, it means you've got to pay somebody, like your descendants, will have to pay taxes in the future. Now, that was the argument to say that, therefore, if there's a government deficit now, the public will respond to that by spending less. So the deficit won't stimulate the economy at all. Now, that's stage one. Stage two is just when people said, yeah, well, okay, Robert, but that might mean the deficit might be now, the surplus might be in 50 or 60 years' time, and people don't live forever. You said, oh no, people will save for their ancestors. Everybody, literally, he wrote, people operate in an extended dynasty that effectively means they live forever. That is nonsense.
Well, but let's put it into the context of the European Union. Can every single nation in the European Union run a budget surplus?
This is the other side, which is where when you start thinking in a monetary sense, and you guys implicitly, innately think that way, if I'm going to take money out of your pocket, I'm going to get more in mine and less in yours. It's just that simple, and the same thing applies when you look at financial flows between countries. If you have two countries involved in trade and one runs a surplus, the other has to run an equivalent deficit. Okay, and that's the simple accounting that lies behind thinking about the economy in a monetary way. So what the Germans are saying is, we can run a surplus, why can't the rest of you? And the answer is because you're running a surplus. It's to say, my analogy is you're on a seesaw, and the person gets to the top and looks down and says, I'm up here, why can't you be? And he says, because you are.
Well, you mentioned this seesaw. Okay, the seesaw operates on a fulcrum. Yeah. That's supposed to be, restore some equilibrium.
Some balance, yeah.
Some balance, right? But we live in a world where the seesaw is operating, where the fulcrum is way, way, way toward the extreme, which defies all logic.
In fact, there's a better way of putting it, which is you're on the right track, which is the swing's moving. or the seesaw's moving. So you think if it actually was stationary, if the economy actually got back to a balance again, then ultimately the price mechanism would get you there. Because you've got a moving thing through time, that can actually keep one end of the seesaw up indefinitely. And the movement means Germany is growing, its technological change is going at a greater pace than Greece. It's going to have a cost advantage coming in all the time. which might be cut back by devaluation if they were able to devalue, but the devaluations won't catch up with the bonus. So we were told 50 or 40 years ago that floating exchange rates would eliminate balance of payments, surpluses and deficits. Well, it hasn't, because we live in a growing economy.
It replaced gold, and gold, for better or worse, it did kind of supply that fixed place upon which the gold standard, it created this kind of balance and equilibrium for 100 years.
We should have had the Bancor instead, but yeah, that was that.
I've heard people suggest that the euro currency should have instead been a Bancor. Explain how that would have been different, what it would have looked like.
The idea of the Bancor was Keynes' suggestion for what should be the monetary system after the Second World War at Bretton Woods, overruled by the Americans, and want the American currency to be the reserve currency for international trade, whereas Keynes said, no, let's create a currency issued by the International Monetary Fund, which was issued to countries on the basis of the size of their economies. And then if you started running out of it because you're running a trade deficit, you'd be forced to devalue. But equally, if you were getting too much of it by running a trade surplus, you'd be forced to spend the surplus. And that meant that rather than just having a deflationary impact, which is what happens when, if you run a deficit, you can't get a surplus of American dollars if you don't make them yourself. With the Bancor, it would force the Japans and the Germanys to be spending back and buying goods from the rest of the world. That's one of the fundamental reasons why we're in the crisis now.
What's the mechanism for that under the Bancor?
The Bancor had not just that as a deficit country you'd run out, but it had if you ran a surplus indefinitely, you were then taxed on the surplus, and that was spent back into the rest of the global economy.
Okay, so you're taxed at a rate to incentivize you to spend.
Yeah, effectively.
So it's more like an accounting ledger, trade accounting ledger. It's not something that would circulate within economies.
Well, it circulate between countries. So if I wanted to buy an American car like a Tesla, and import it from America, I'd then pay for it, which would mean I'd be using English pounds to buy this Bancor, to then be transferred to America, where the Bancor would be converted into American dollars and given to the Tesla company, which would then shift me the car. So it would be international trade, but wouldn't be trade within a nation. And the great mistake of the euro was it went from being something like a European version of the Bancor with the EQ mechanism to being used internally as well as externally, and that's disastrous.
Oh yes, they had that before they had the euro. They had the ECU.
ECU.
So it was like that. They were trading against that, and so it did provide like a false sense of stability. It created that sense of stability before the euro was then created.
And then the euro comes in and all the disasters of the euro, but not just the fact that there's no treasury, but also there's limits on government deficits and government debt, which have always been stupid.
Okay, so austerity, it's a remnant of David Ricardo, a contemporary of Adam Smith.
Yeah, Ricardo's not actually guilty. The economists will steal names to make themselves look sophisticated, and I wonder whether.
But that's where it kind of, you're saying the genesis of it, kind of where it's worked its way through, and it was built on a faulty foundation, and the proof is in the pudding. It's an unworkable for these various reasons. What's the next one?
Well, I wanted to talk about the role of the finance sector on this. This is something that you have spoken about very often on the Kaiser Report, even in episode 4, you talked about how big the finance sector should be. So when people talk about Greece and those bad Greeks and all their debt and they're lazy and they don't work hard enough and they retire too early and all this stuff, the fact is that the debt was previously private debt.
Yeah.
It was owed to banks who banks were lending to Greece at under 5% at one point. It went from 24% was the average 10-year yield on the Greek treasury before the euro. And then the bankers assumed that the Germans would bail them out, obviously, because Greek debt was trading at exactly what the German debt was. So the institutions, as Yanis Varoufakis called them, the Troika, came in, took that private debt after there was a bit of a write-down.
Yeah, there was.
They took that debt from the private banks and transferred it to the sovereigns, which then made it an impossible political situation because you're not supposed to default to the IMF or to the sovereigns. So what about the role of this notion that these banks must be saved and that we must convert their debt into something almost divine, that it's like an infallible debt that cannot be betrayed.
And this actually is tied up partly with the German word about debt, which apparently means shame or something of that nature. What is actually going on is we're mistaking what happens between individuals for what happens when a bank is involved. Because if I borrowed your lovely red coat there and didn't return it to you, okay, I've robbed you of the coat. There's a sense of shame for me in doing that. But when a bank makes a loan, it's simply making an entry on a double entry ledger. Here's the amount of money you owe us. Here's the amount of money. And it literally is handwriting, or pressing computer keyboards to create millions. So writing off that debt is nothing like not returning something that you had beforehand. It's created out of nothing. It can go back to nothing. And we should be writing debt off as a regular basis of a functioning capitalist economy.
So it's like a game of Monopoly. Once there's no more property to buy on the thing, you say, okay, let's start over again. And you play again.
Yeah, right. I mean, banks make money by lending money.
Yeah.
That's what a bank does. That's their job.
And you don't want to let them create too much, because if their source of profit is creating debt, they can create it at virtually zero cost. That's a great encouragement to create too much of the stuff.
Right, but on the other side of that ledger, the rules are constantly changing. Let's say the Basel Accord, Basel I, Basel II, Basel III, which allow them to keep less on reserves.
Yeah.
So that their collateral for these loans is now down below 2%.
Yeah.
Instead of 10%.
It's a whole leverage thing. It's a leverage to the equity ratio they've got. And when you've got ratios, banks make money by being highly levered organisations. So they're going to make they make small gains and large leverage. And of course, they get as the boom goes on, they're encouraged to amplify that leverage. They go from a 10 to 1 to 15 to 1, 20 to 1, 30 to 1. At that stage, they've actually financed a lot of losing investments. Something's got to fail. They're going to fall over. We have to write the debt off.
Plus, the way they categorize collateral is they are constantly revising it so that they could take, let's say, junk bonds and say, no, this is AAA paper.
Yeah.
But also, you just mentioned that banks get wealthy, get rich, get big using leverage. That's how the ordinary person, however, gets poor.
Exactly, and it's now a direct relationship. I can actually argue quite emphatically from my modelling, which comes down to putting a set of definitions together. Okay. The argument is workers pay for rising debt levels in lower wages share. It's the workers who pay.
We're going to continue talking about that in the second half. But I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about moral hazard. This notion about the morality of debt and who should actually, where the morality should be applied to is.
Yeah, exactly. So stay tuned for the second half. We're going to be talking about the morality of debt. And if you are in debt, are you immoral? And are the French right by categorizing those who are indebted under laws that would classify you as a pornographer? Okay, that's what the French are doing. Welcome back to the Kaiser Report and Summer Solutions. Now, before the break, Steve Keen, I was mentioning France, actually. Now, it's interesting because during the 2008 crisis in France, they were trying to pass legislation that would equate bankers who commit these frauds under laws similar to kiddie, pedophiles. That there was the equivalent to shame them.
Okay.
It's like financial pedophilia. And I don't know where that had gone, but they were trying to shame the bankers. Is there an easier way? Can't they just maybe apply some legal strenuousness?
I think we have to first of all recognise that they banks, they create money at no cost. Okay. Secondly, they've therefore got a massive encouragement to get us to borrow as much money as possible. For us to fall for the borrowing, we don't borrow for consumer items all that much. We only borrow if we believe we're going to ride an asset bubble. So it ends up banks finance asset bubbles, we then have crises and crashes. We have to cut off this milk of asset bubbles and force them to lend as they should do, which is towards businesses and entrepreneurs. But at the same time, we've got to make the entrepreneurial lending easier for them, because I can understand a bank not wanting to lend entrepreneurs because 4 out of 5 of them go bust. Yes. Well, okay, we're going to talk about morality in a second, but first I want to note something that popped into my mind when you said banks create money at no cost. Yeah. A lot of our world around us was created, the concepts were created in a different era. So the notion of copyright, for example, was created when it cost a fortune to publish a book. Yeah. The actual physical process cost a lot of money. Yeah. And that was why the copyright was created, in order to make sure that the guy can make his money back after publishing the book. Yeah. Now it costs nothing to publish a book, to tweet something. The same thing with money, it seems. So it seems like we're based in like old world. Yeah. And even if you go back to when banks did double entry bookkeeping ledgers, it was simply a case of somebody writing down, we're going to lend you £50 and you owe us £50. And the fact that banks can create money out of double entry bookkeeping, that's always been there.
Yeah.
But now, of course, it's even easier. I mean, my favourite example, which I may have told you guys before, was when a New Zealand service station or petrol station owner applied for an overdraft of 100,000 New Zealand dollars, and when he got it approved, when he went to check his account, the overdraft was actually 10 million.
Yeah.
Now what had happened is some clerk had forgotten to press the full decimal point and type the 00 keyboard you've got on bank keyboards.
But when they withdrew it from him, did it cause deflation?
He took off with 7 million quid and went back to dollars, went to China. But that's, in other words, one physical step less created 100 times as much money.
So half a calorie of energy.
Less creates 100 times as much. You cannot do that with anything else.
But Max brought up the notion of morality and shame and stuff like that. And you've mentioned in the first half that the German word for debt implies shame as well. Now, it seems that everybody has bought that notion that all of the moral responsibility lies with the debtor. But in economics, it would seem to me that moral hazard is actually something relating to creditors, because is it not their job to
assess risk,
to dole out capital and see,
Yeah, and this is what if people are talking about the moral hazard of some Marin Park kettle crowd in Kentucky, defrauding a bank by getting a loan they couldn't afford to repay. Marin Park Kettle haven't got 100 PhD rocket scientists and economists in the back room negotiating the deal. It's the banks that created this stuff. They're the ones who fall for the moral hazard, because we've doubled up on the moral hazard because they can give themselves bonuses out of the rising value of debt, and now the state comes along and rescues them.
So no, the moral hazard's never applied to the borrower. It's a euphemism for when banks commit fraud.
And that's
they call it moral hazard.
Yeah,
if somebody else doesn't repay their debt, they call them a criminal and put them in jail. They don't say, you're being morally hazardous, don't do that again.
Yeah, but they're saying that the moral hazard is that now the Greeks will keep on borrowing, they'll spend too much. That it was the Greeks somehow themselves who were spending too much, and not the banks lending them too much money.
It's a lot of evidence that Greek is a patronage state.
Yes.
So a huge part of the money was used to buy political favours, to hire large numbers of public servants for doing useless jobs in terms of political favouring. So the Greeks have contributed on that level. But fundamentally, lending into a state that does that shows you're not doing a risk assessment properly.
Yes, exactly. Now, we also, you were talking about the bankers. So you have redefined, you came up with 3 new categories. There's wage earners, there's finance sector, and there's capitalists.
That's right.
So the real conflict, you say, is not between wage earners and capitalists, but between wage earners and finance sector and capitalism. So tell us about this, and what is the solution? How do we change these dynamics?
Well, this is one. Minsky argued that capitalism is fundamentally flawed, because it said it's due to characteristics the financial system must have to be consistent with full-blown capitalism. And he said such a signal will be capable of generating signals that give you a desire to invest, increasing desire to invest, and financing that investment. Now, to say it's must means you simply can't reform it away. And I've been reworking my model of Minsky. I realised I can reduce it to 3 absolutely true statements. The first is that workers' share of output will rise if wage rises exceed productivity. Employment will rise if the rate of growth exceeds population growth and technical change. And the debt level ratio will rise if the debt level rises faster than GDP. Now, those are 3 simple, factual statements. Disagreeing with them is like saying, I disagree with gravity, I'm going to go out this window and walk over the other side of the river. So when you put it together, you then find that, in fact, the capitalist share fluctuates around an equilibrium. If you have the characteristic that gives you a rising debt ratio, that is offset for a while by a cyclically declining workers' share. So workers directly pay for the rising level of debt.
We've seen that for the past 30 years.
You have.
Workers' wages have declined like that.
But the punchline is that at a certain level, workers are accepting as much of a wage cut as they can and will, because they've got constraints on how much they can afford to cut given rent to pay and stuff like that. You get deflation becoming the rule in the economy, and then the compounding impact of debt, interest on debt, plus the deflation amplifying that interest, you get an exponential takeoff on the debt level, and the capitalists who are bouncing along cycling will suddenly go crash. Where the hell did that come from? It's because of this distribution between workers and bankers.
Okay, can't you create equilibrium between workers and bankers by tying wages to money supply growth?
You could do something like that. You have to do something that stops debt getting out of control. And all my suggestions
So
about...
when somebody in this country argues for a wage increase, they always say we want to tie it to inflation or be 1 or 2 points above inflation. But that's a losing game. They should argue we want our wages to be pari passu with money supply growth. So if money supply growth was up 20% last year, then wages should be up 20%.
And that's actually, I hadn't thought of that particular mechanism, but something like that would mean you undermine the possibility for debt to bubble up as it does.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
How come I don't get an A? You know,
Well, I'd better remark
why can't
your
I get a
exam, mate.
degree?
Yeah.
Why can't you give me an economics
I think
degree
we'll have
from
to.
whatever college
Honorary,
it is?
definitely.
The King's College?
But you mentioned
Kingston College? I wanted my degree. I invented something new.
But you mentioned this debt, and this is the art form of capitalism that we've had now for the past 50 years, really, 40, 50 years, that it's a never-ending boom and bust, boom and bust. And there has been one place where wages have been rising, that's China. But now they seem to have gone, in the last year, to a doubling and tripling of some of their stock markets. It's gone crazy. Part of it is day traders. They're now allowed to day trade. People are taking on massive leverage. And, of course, the Minsky moment arise. Is there ever a solution to the Minsky moment? Because when the markets crashed by 30% in 2 weeks in China, I have a quote here from Beijing, quote, had been struggling to find a policy formula to restore confidence in its stock markets, which is, of course, the exact same sort of statements that came out in 1929.
Yeah.
But is there a solution at all to the Minsky moment other than just crash and write off the debt?
Well, no, the only solution is to write off the debt as you go and stop it accumulating in the first place. We've hit debt levels. A colleague of mine, Richard Vague, is a leading American banker, has done a nice empirical study that showed that every crisis in the last 150 years in capitalism, 45 or so, every crisis has been preceded by private debt exceeding 1.5 times GDP and the ratio growing by about 15 to 20% or more over a 5-year period. China blows that out of the water. Its debt level rose by 80% over about the last 5 or 6 years and is now over 180% heading towards 200% of GDP.
But this is a solution that you're offering here today. This is a revolutionary solution, as you think we should have rolling debt jubilees.
We have to have them. Yeah.
And what does that look like?
It's called a business cycle, which has been outlawed through the Greenspan put or the monetary put. Like whenever there's a downtick, we're just going to cut rates and flood money. Here's a question for you. This will get my master's degree in economics. It's a theory called financial narcissism. So in other words, as it plays into the Minsky moment, as day traders have success, they are increasingly narcissistic to believe that they're the ones who are making the success happen.
That's right.
So they go from thinking, I don't know anything to do about this. I don't know what these stocks are. Then they start trading stocks, and they're part of the mania. Then they believe it's them individually in a very highly narcissistic way, that it's their activity that's making all this good stuff happen. So, and as narcissism in mythology, it leads to tragedy.
Yeah, I think that's very apt, and that's what the sort of behaviour you can see amongst people. People think the stock markets, they think they're a genius when their house gets more expensive.
You see that all the time in comments. If you even mention that we should stop house price bubbles, the comments right now below in the YouTube will be like, just because you weren't smart enough to buy the property from Margaret Thatcher when she flipped these council estates for a 50% discount, just because you weren't smart enough and happened to be alive then, you're just jealous.
Yeah, exactly. And they don't see what's actually driving it. It's this rising level of leverage. The only way that a house can continue rising in price faster than incomes is that the next person who buys it off you borrows more money than you did. Or you sell it to a Russian or a Saudi Arabian oligarch.
And the way that happens is banks make lending requirements more lax.
Yeah, and it's absolutely simple. And economics has pulled the wool over our eyes completely on this.
So I'll give you another example, the portrait of Dorian Gray. So here you have people buying and selling property outside, not knowing that in the attic there's a portrait of their debt and their house price turning into mud until the Minsky moment hits. Yep. And then suddenly they're old hags, and the equivalent being oh my God, my flat's lost 60% of its value.
And that's a crash that hit Spain, it hit America, it's starting in the Netherlands. Ultimately get to the stage where you simply can't, people will not take on the initial debt to get in there. And if they stop taking it in, it's just like that tulip market when no buyers turned up. end of bubble, you know, down it comes. But the state continues reflating it because politicians now believe that you can't have a successful economy without a financial sector of the size to which this parasite has grown. They're trying to keep the portrait of Dorian Gray alive.
With cheap money and reduced collateral requirements and state subsidies for help
So
to
the
buy
solution
schemes.
is to like rip up the photo, the portrait of Dorian
That's
Gray.
debt forgiveness.
Because George Osborne here, his solution is to bring in like Jim O'Neill from Goldman Sachs, to bring in all the same people who caused this problem.
Yeah, we've got to get to the stage where we've got to see debt is no longer shame. Okay,
Yep.
Debt has to be written off. It's a sensible part of capitalism.
So you have to go,
We can survive.
woohoo, I went bankrupt.
You need to put all the banks into what I would call a circular firing squad, and then your problem is done. It's all gone. We got to go, Steve Keen. Thanks for this being on the Solutions episode, and we'll see you again soon.
Indeed.
Stacey, thanks.
And remember, if you have any solutions of your own, suggest them down below in the YouTube or send them in to Twitter at Kaiser Report.
That's going to do it for this segment of Summer Solutions. I'd like to thank our guest, Steve Keen. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Kaiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.